For the longest time, after I began writing Citro, I always stopped myself when people asked, "Who's your favorite superhero?" My immediate response in my mind was always Citro. The most disappointing part is no one knows who Citro is. But things are different now. There's been this revolution in the superhero genre. There were a lot of answers I gave to that question, and plenty I could still give, because there are a ton of great heroes out there, famous ones too, that I don't need to explain to you. If I choose one, you'd most likely know who I'm talking about, or will have the ability to look them up and find instant references. But none of them were the answers I wanted to give. When you're asked that question, it's not meant to probe into deep discussion about someone you've never heard of. No, you say Spider-Man, Superman, great heroes by the way, and then you go about the rest of your day. Or you talk a bit more about your superhero. You have everything you need to bring up references or look them up if you're unfamiliar with him. But, again, not an answer I was ever satisfied with. Serviceable, but not perfect. Well, today, this video is the start of my answer. My discussion of why Citro remains my favorite hero of all time. And to be clear, I mean this Citro, not this one. And just to clarify before we jump into the playtest, I'll answer questions and we can chat toward the end of the stream. The stream will go for about an hour, but might be a bit longer because this one's important. So important, in fact, for the first time on this channel, you're seeing the face behind this game, behind Avium, behind the Citroverse. So if you're still interested, if you're a fan of my content, then the least I can do is show you what it all means to me. Let you jump into the universe for a couple minutes. Let me lay the foundation of this story by first describing how I came up with Citro, and in fact, how I came up with most of my heroes in the Citroverse. I start with the powers. You know, when I was younger, a friend and I had this game we'd occasionally play back and forth. The game was, think of any ability, any power that there is, even if it's not mainstream, and just think of what you would do with that power. Think of what you would be able to accomplish with that power. Think of the weaknesses, the strengths, the potential, the possibilities. And then, try to think of a situation where you would be fighting each other with those powers. So it's a very competitive game, especially as kids. You want to think of the best power, and one that doesn't have any convoluted loopholes, or one that doesn't seem illegitimate or inconsistent. So there we were, thinking of abilities, you know, like the power to control water. You would think that to combat that, you would need, well, not fire, obviously. How about lightning? Electricity? That would be a potential adversary for water. But here's where it gets tricky. What if water suddenly turns into steam, where it's unaffected by a simple shock? Let's say I did choose pyrokinesis. I wouldn't only have the ability to manipulate flames, I can create them, influence the atoms in objects to vibrate faster and cause spontaneous combustions. To truly control fire at the atomic level. Think of how you'd need to defend yourself against something like water, using nothing but fire. You gotta get creative. You can't just throw up a firewall and hope for the best when your opponent sends a wave of water at you, or summons a geyser under your feet. You need to concentrate on those water molecules, heat them up, boil them into steam before they can reach you, and drown you. But even then, it's not over. See, your opponent has hydrokinesis, the complete control over water in all its forms. So, solid, liquid, gas, you get it. Now you need to contend with the vapor form. What do you do then? Can your fire reach Planck temperature, the hottest temperature theorized in our universe? At that point, any molecule in your presence is rendered useless. But, again, your opponent's clever. Just because your fire can reach absolute hot doesn't mean he can't cool his ice to absolute zero, the coldest theoretical temperature in our universe, in order to counteract your heat. So, one attack cancels out the other. What's next? Do you develop fire weapons in order to even the odds? Or do you take a more psychological route and begin burning the environment to distract your opponent as you plot your next move? There's just so much you can do with so little. And this is just a fraction of the examples I intend to show and have described in my books. Just these simple abilities you would use back and forth, try to one-up each other. And so, you know, taking that game and evolving upon it were what started me on the journey of creating Citro. For me, it turned into more than just a game. It became more or less a chronicle. And then the question popped into my head, what if I had 3 powers? I could only ever have 3, not any more than that. But within those powers, I could evolve them. I can explore them to their absolute limit. And so, Citro was born when I started exploring those 3 powers. And those 3 powers are telekinesis, teleportation, and super strength. Which brings me to an excellent point where I can show you just what I'm talking about. I have here my 2 novels, Supreme Heroes and its sequel, Citro Dirge of Indemnity. I'm going to be using references and examples straight from these books to describe Citro's 3 powers. Let's begin with telekinesis. Telekinesis in this case refers to the basic starting point under the umbrella of psychokinesis. All kinesis abilities fall under the broader term of psychokinesis, but the foundation always begins with telekinesis, the movement of objects. If your interests lean more towards fire-based magic, then the next ability to follow would be pyrokinesis, the rapid movement and vibration of atoms within an object to cause spontaneous combustion. Then there's photokinesis, geokinesis, etc. Also, I'll be switching back and forth between the names Citro and Jake. Citro is just Jake's alter ego, like Spider-Man to Peter Parker. I'm going to define what it means to have telekinesis in the Citroverse. We start with a reference from Citro Dirge of Indemnity. Page 31, paragraph 4. Quote, "We unveiled his final gift of telekinesis, which is how he is able to learn and develop 3 levels of these powers: darkness, light, and in between. This power is not only for the psychic ability, but for knowledge and super senses also. Telekinesis has its many diverse forms, but with him, he can manipulate the space around objects to expand or shrink, to compress or stretch. Mentally expanding the space between him and the object, like stretching putty, forces the object to repel away from him. By shrinking the space between him and the object will draw towards him. Compressing the space around the object causes the object to implode or condense itself. Stretching the space around the object, or inside of the object, causes its molecules to rend apart until it explodes. The size of the object, whether it's microscopic or skyscraper size, does not limit his power. In fact, for anti-gravity, he uses all 4 sublevels of this power to grant him high jumps, even to the point of short-term flight and wall sprinting capabilities, by manipulating the space around buildings." And we'll get to some demonstration references from Supreme Heroes. Page 24, paragraph 9. "He landed onto the empty motorcycle and sped off around buildings to avoid long-range attacks by the giant. Globs of boiling water splashed behind him as he sped along the chaotic street. He used his ability of flight to increase the speed of this vehicle, and was able to maneuver better and quicker than ever. It was as if the bike was part of his body. He easily performed entire front flips, full back flips, and even 360s. Not to mention gravity was nothing. He could literally ride on the walls of buildings, or whatever he wanted, to outdo this water giant." And an example of more than one ability he uses, sort of an example of multiple kinesis abilities all at once, is the next page, paragraph 2 to 3. "Now his current location on the highway began shaking. Screams filled his ears. Cars began falling off higher roads like rain as the ground beneath them shifted into dust. Jake staggered when cracks started forming around his position, but he kept his focus on the civilians in the car thrown by the giant. The cracks now started forming holes to equal out his weight, when suddenly he shot off the asphalt with a nuclear-like blast of pure light. Many light shockwaves that dispersed from Jake's takeoff spread across the broken highway and began mending all the cracks of the road together again." So that right there was an example of A few abilities: geokinesis, manipulation of earth, photokinesis, manipulation of light, and of course telekinesis, manipulation of objects. So this ability also accounts for wisdom. It's like having both premonition and memories of the past beyond your own life. So as the journey unfolds, we begin to see him evolve past basic telekinesis into other super abilities like chronokinesis, the manipulation of time. There are examples here in Supreme Heroes where Jake exhibits just mere slivers of other kinesis abilities. I wanted to include these abilities to establish that eventually Jacob will obtain some level of control over them, but in his early years he only has minimal access to them. Telekinesis is the foundation of Citro's growth. It's a mental super ability that also helps him define other abilities. Not to a mastery level, mind you. See, that's the difference between Citro and Geyser, his mortal enemy. Geyser has a complete mastery over hydrokinesis, water manipulation. An absolute mastery. Even cryokinesis, ice manipulation. Everything water-based, Geyser has a mastery over, and so there's no real way to beat him with water. It's pretty much impossible. He's going to have the edge every time because that's his element. So any sort of knowledge that you have as the character Jake in cryokinesis or hydrokinesis is going to be trounced by Geyser's ability. So in those cases, that's where you want to explore water's weakness, lightning, and you'll want to exploit it. In the game, an example of telekinesis is the power of flight. Imagine doing pull-ups, You're using your arms to pull yourself up, and in that sense, you're moving your body up through the air. Well, what Citro does with telekinesis is literally just that, pulling on objects at a greater distance, so it's not perfect flight, which is why he develops wings for stabilization. Perfect flight would be like Superman's flight. Supergirl, Wonder Woman, Thor, Homelander, Omni-Man. You get it. All those characters can fly, and there's pretty much no hindrance for them. But for Citro, yeah, he has to have some objects around in order to manipulate the space around them, and then he can fly. Let's talk about teleportation. So we're going back to the references, and we're going to page 31 of Citro Dirge of Indemnity, paragraph 3. He has the gift of teleporting from a single area to another, or teleporting objects from one place to another without physically touching or occupying the objects. Each teleportation occurs with an orange flash. And so let's dive a little bit deeper into this orange flash. We're going to Supreme Heroes, page Roman numeral 11. Marco always stayed in the western part of the earth, but as with the other archangels, traveling was not a challenge. They could merely teleport from one location to another without effort. The glamour of their fluorescent orange was proof of their unique relocation. And one last example of how Citro uses teleportation is found in page 123, paragraph 1. He focused all his attention on the image of a blade in the dark abyss. Now he envisioned himself holding the blade. The sword was dissolving from existence and coming back together in Jake's hand, slowly, in an orange smoke. When he opened his eyes, the full blade was in his hands. His face had a grand smile on it once he saw the weapon in his hand. He re-transported the sword back into its sheath with a quick breath. And, yeah, so teleportation, pretty straightforward. We're going to talk about super strength now. Super strength depicted here is not raw strength, but rather the endurance of the musculature and skeletal structures that are enabled the moment natural strength fails. Its maximum threshold is always 3 times that of normal humans. So going to Citro Dirge of Indemnity, back to page 31. paragraph 2.
He is gifted with the power of enhanced strength, being able to endure 3 times as much as a human. Only where human strength fails, his enhanced strength prevails, so he is not super strong 24/7. A human can be killed with 1 bullet. He can be killed with 3. A human can lift 500 pounds. He can lift 1,500. When a human falls 8 stories, he or she dies on the ground. But when he falls 8 stories, 3 cascading craters form under him to cushion him from what should be a normal death fall, instead making it a near-death fall.
So for example, typically it takes only 1 shot to take us out, right? Lights out, we're done. But for him, it takes 3. It's not regeneration or a super healing factor, it's just his incredible endurance. I know this has been an extensive introduction, but stay with me. I promise to answer any questions at the end of the stream, and we'll be jumping into gameplay right after this. With all of that said, that brings me to the setup. The universe in which the story takes place is much like our universe, but with an injection of magic. When I say magic, it's not magic on the scale of Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter, but more like on the scale of Final Fantasy or Devil May Cry. A modern world with a noticeable presence of supernaturalism. Rare, very rare in this case, but possible. It's so rare in the Citroverse, in fact, that to demonstrate feats of supernatural skill is often condemned, or looked at as blasphemy, or is the result of a troubled mind, or you're a fake, a phony, a forgery, using doctored footage, AI. You get it. In the world of Supreme Heroes, it's considered general knowledge that, aside from religious texts and unusual coincidences, only some highly trained guru or some dedicated monk from some faraway place in the mountains who's trained for decades could ever come close to claiming they've obtained some measure of supernatural abilities. And yet, when it becomes clear that Citro and his team not only demonstrate impossible feats of abnormal strength and elemental manipulation, but also save people using those skills, they're actually not seen as pretenders or witches and demons, but as the heroes they're professing to be. It somehow finally dawns on humanity that supernatural powers do exist, and that some of the relics and texts of old perhaps weren't just fables. Of course, not everyone can accept those that exhibit these supernatural traits. Some see it as a disruption to the natural course of life. Some even find ways to obtain similar powers in order to outdo the heroes and claim the spotlight. And others who have had powers all along find that it's safe to reveal their nature now that Jake and his team of heroes are becoming mainstream. And through it all is the core of this story. The path of justice is one continually riddled with obstacles, some capable of unwittingly turning that path into one of vengeance, should you not be wise to its growing thorns. And this is where we get to why Citro remains my favorite hero of all time. We follow on his path of justice. However, because of certain events that happen in Supreme Heroes, his path begins to change. He deviates from justice, makes it personal, which I probably would too if I endured what Jake went through. Not gonna spoil it. But he's warned about the darkness in his heart at every turn. He's well aware that darkness is there, but he fights for the light. He tries to anyway. Certain people in his sphere don't make it easy. In fact, one person directly contributes to his straying away from justice. And I can't say what ends up happening to that person is undeserved, but there is a cost to using the influence of evil and villainy. So Jake isn't this altruistic, perfect guy. He's a guy with issues, like anyone. He tries so hard to reason with this one person, to come at the conflict between them from an angle of forgiveness and virtue and understanding, only to have that compassion slapped away time and time again. And eventually, he breaks. This is who we see in a 2-minute snapshot when we start up the game. This is a grizzled Jake who's 2 years older, 2 years wiser, 2 years darker, who's endured something tragic and decided to take up vengeance for it. So be ready for that in the sequel, but the context is what we, the player, will discover during this first story. So what starts as a story of justice and camaraderie evolves into one of great tragedy and loss, and what one does to cope with that loss. And being so young and alone at the time of that loss, it's almost inevitable in some ways for Jake to give in to villainy, vengeance. And you'll really get to see why he opens his mind to darkness after certain events. One of my favorite stories in cinema is Star Wars Revenge of the Sith, because we see how Anakin falls, but more importantly, we can see in the beginning just how great he can be, the potential to be one of the greatest Jedi of his time. And yet, we know what happens. We get to see his fall into darkness. Supreme Heroes is meant to be the start of a saga, to take you along the journey as Jake experiences some of the greatest moments as well as the darkest moment of his life, all while having fun in your own way, gaining some of Jake's coolest abilities, and getting through a ton of enemies and creative obstacles where you have to rely on your wits and your freshly gained abilities. That's what Supreme Heroes is all about. It's the most ambitious project I've ever done, next to Avium, and it's not going to be easy delivering on this promise, but this is my story, and it's time it gets told properly. And I hope you're as invested as I am in seeing this hero prevail against evil. Let's jump into the playtest.